Welcome in to the Southeastern 14 podcast, or the 14, as we like to call it. I'm your host, Chris Lee. Blake Lovell alongside with me. Blake, 3 basketball games went down in the SEC on Wednesday night. All had significance of their own. There were some things we didn't expect to see. We will go through all 3 of those games. Let's start with the one that I think you and I probably feel is the most significant. Ole Miss doesn't just beat Missouri. Ole Miss waxes Missouri in a game that was lopsided for quite a while. Final score from Oxford, Ole Miss 80, Missouri 59. I don't think either of us were shocked that the Rebels won that game. I think the margin of victory was a little bit flooring, though.
Agreed. I think that's. I feel like we sort of discussed the possibilities of this being a tough spot. I think for Missouri in this game, just because of the way they finished the game against Alabama, even though they did win the game, but they didn't have a great finish, and now having to go on the road, and play a team like this who has been hot, as we said, is really strange to think that they have. Won back-to-back games before this game, 52-50 and 86-84. And now, it's like they get the best of both worlds here. They get good offense and they get good defense. I think that's what makes Ole Miss pretty dangerous. So it was. I mean, they were in control here, and they really didn't look back. And I wonder, what this looks like for Ole Miss moving forward, because we had the conversation about how Ole Miss probably wasn't going to be an NCAA tournament team, or maybe was on the outside looking in and they really needed some quality wins. Well, this was a significant one, as was the one against Tennessee about a week ago. So they picked up a couple of big wins here in a week, and I feel like, at least at this point, when you look ahead, the problem we said with Ole Miss was that they don't have enough quality win opportunities left. But, I mean, they made the most of the biggest one that they did have left here, and let's not forget, they get a rematch coming up in 12 days against Missouri. So it was a significant, victory. It was a dominant victory at times, and this is exactly what I think Ole Miss is capable of. They just haven't done it consistently enough like they have the past week.
Let's dive into the significance of the win before we get into some specifics of what we saw. This was a game that Ole Miss was, okay, I think this is a good way to put it. You had to squint to see the Rebels being able to make their way into the NCAA field of 68. And I think that started with, this was one that Ole Miss had to pick up. It did. You occasionally will see a team come out of the blue to get an NCAA bid. Vanderbilt did that about 4 years ago, where the Commodores, I think, were sub 500 around this time, but had some big wins and started picking up several more this time of the year. So for Ole Miss, there's a start there. The Rebels climbed from 64 in the NCAA's net rankings all the way up to 56. Again, not there yet. It's still a tough needle to thread, but at least Ole Miss has started to put itself in position to where if it can win some remaining games, and let me tell you what's ahead for the Rebels. They've got South Carolina on the road, Mississippi State at home, Missouri on the road, Vanderbilt on the road, and Kentucky at home. I think that the Rebels are going to have a tough time beating Missouri on the road in the rematch, but hey, they just beat Missouri by 21, so who knows? But let's say Ole Miss wins 4 of the 5. At that point, this team would be, 10-7 with a makeup game to come. I don't know who that would be. Let's play that out hypothetically. Again, that's going to be tough to do. I don't think that Ole Miss probably wins 4 out of 5. But the Rebels do that, then all of a sudden I think that they are in the conversation at that point heading into the SEC tournament. A national overall record would be 18-11. What do you think of the Rebels if they can get to that point, Blake?
I think they're right there if they get to that point. Because like we said, I think even though maybe their resume to this point hasn't been overly impressive, I do think those 2 wins against Tennessee and Missouri, those are ones that they can kind of build off of and be able to use those, when it comes down to maybe trying to compare against other teams. Now, on the flip side of that, I think you have to look at, maybe Dayton hasn't finished as strong as you want them to right now. And so that loss doesn't look as great. Wichita State, this is where we talk about, if you're a team like this that maybe potentially puts yourself on the bubble, this is when you start rooting for teams like that, like Dayton and Wichita State that you've lost to try to maybe even make a push themselves at getting to the tournament, which is probably going to be something, like we said, it's going to take a lot of victories to get there. But the season sweep by Georgia is probably something also that if you're Ole Miss, that's the kind of games that you want back, especially that home game at Georgia they had a month ago. So that's one of the issues I think with Ole Miss is that they have some of those losses that don't particularly look great right now, but they can make up for it by continuing to add these type of wins. If they were to get the season sweep of Missouri, then that changes things a bit. But if a 4-1 finish, to be 15-9 overall, I think they'd be at that point. You'd have to feel like they'd probably still feel a lot more comfortable winning a game in the SEC tournament. I would think they may still need that at that point, but this is where we also get to that conversation of, okay, it's a little bit about what you do, but it's also about what other teams do around the country. And as we talked about on the previous episode of the podcast, Chris, I think this is the kind of year where you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you're having to maybe be, at the whim of someone else around the country, especially when we know what the uncertain nature of these conference tournaments is going to be.
Yes, and to your point, nothing happens in a bubble. And you look across the landscape, a lot of games have been canceled, not just in conference, but outside the conference. I always look as I am analyzing a team's resume at big wins. And I think once you get 4 or 5 against teams in the tournament field, provided your other metrics are there, that used to be RPI, that is now net, that's when I start to feel confident. The good with Ole Miss, there really are no bad losses on there. Worst loss by Ken Palm is twice to number 90 Georgia. They lost also 1-81 Wichita State and 85 Dayton. So they're not, I wouldn't say they're necessarily good losses, but they're not losses that really kill you. I guess 2 of them were on the road and 2 were at home. So losing 2 like that at home doesn't help. But the problem for Ole Miss is it just has not banked a lot of huge wins. The 2 that get your attention, of course, are Missouri and Tennessee. And so you have that, but I don't see anybody else that the Rebels have beaten that is probably an NCAA tournament team at this point, at least unless it's a one-bid league like a Wilmington or a Central Arkansas or somebody like that gets in. Just not a lot of wins that pop off the page. And so to me, again, under that scenario, the needle becomes pretty difficult to thread. But let's talk about the specifics of the game itself. You look at the box score, Romello White has 30 points over the weekend, shows up big in that win. Last night, he gets 2 points, 4 fouls, only plays about 12 minutes. But what you saw, and this has been the criticism of Ole Miss all year, was just lacking that offensive firepower. Well, getting 80 against Missouri is an outstanding showing. And it's not just that. It's that there's kids on that team who can score. Devontae Shuler, KJ Buffin have been around. But I think the big thing to me was Jarkel Joyner, who was the transfer from Cal State Bakersfield. He gets 19 last night and has had some pretty significant scoring games for the Rebels in conference play. I think if you start getting another score or 2 like White and Joyner who can pop up, all of a sudden it's a different looking Ole Miss team, Blake.
Yeah, and we thought like Romello White, who had the big game previously against Auburn, we kept saying, he's someone that they have to have, do not necessarily score 30 points a night, but he's got to be able to do a lot of things for them pretty regularly for them to feel like they're going to have a chance on offense. But then, like you just said, if you get guys like that, like Jarkel Joyner, who puts up 21, and you have that more of a balance than maybe necessarily having to rely on a couple guys. That helps for sure, and this was just the one thing. It's just, their offense has not been great at times this season, and there's no doubt that it's one of the reasons why, they're probably at this point where they've lost the amount of games they have, because it hasn't really been their defense. But for them to be able to score as consistently as they did in that game, and I think the one thing that stands out too is, and it's wild to think about, because when you look at Missouri, I'm going to pull it up here right now, but I know kind of what the number is pretty close to it. But like Missouri does a pretty good job of defending in the paint because they have good size. We know like they have someone like Tillman in there and being able to take advantage of that. But at the same time, Ole Miss shot 70% from two, and I think that is such a fascinating stat against a team like Missouri because that's not easy to do. And so you have to give them credit. I mean, they took advantage. They were efficient, and I just think it's something where I don't know that Ole Miss is going to do this on a nightly basis, maybe to have that type of efficiency on offense. But if they can just get a couple of those guys coming along and adding that consistency, being able to score regularly outside of maybe just a couple guys, if they can just kind of get maybe 4 or 5 guys that can do that pretty regularly now in some of these games, as we said, their schedule sets up, they're going to have a really nice chance to have a strong finish. And it's driving me crazy because I've been looking up their schedule and I cannot figure out which game got canceled. So I'm very curious to know if maybe one of the games got canceled. It could be one that could be an NCAA tournament type booster. I'm going to find that, Chris, here in a minute. But I think that's something too, is that this team has enough on the defensive side. If they can get the consistency they got on the offensive side, and this like they had in this game against Missouri, they're going to be setting up for a strong finish.
There's a disconnect between the net rankings that Missouri has and the ones on KenPom. For instance, KenPom this morning has got Missouri at 40. Maybe between that and the seeding is a better way to put it. The net rankings have Missouri at 34, so not far off from KenPom, but a lot of people have thought the Tigers were a 3 seed to begin because of those banked wins, right? And Missouri's got about as many as anybody in the country. Missouri is ranked 8th in Ken Pomeroy's luck metric. And what that is, I think statistically, is it's saying you've scored this many points on the season, you've given up that many, and this may be oversimplifying it a bit, but generally a team that's got those profiles statistically wins X percentage of their games. Missouri has won more games than it quote unquote should have won, and that is responsible for this connect. But Missouri drops 9 spots in the net with that loss. I have to think this is one that damages the Tigers in terms of NCAA tournament seeding. Again, I think Missouri gets there because I think when you look at the resume that it's had with all the big wins, that's going to be really tough to ignore unless there's just a huge losing streak down the stretch. But I have to think, that the people on the committee are going to look at KenPom and Sagarin and other rankings, and it's going to say that this team isn't quite as good as its record. I have to think that starts to catch up with Missouri a little bit, don't you think?
Yeah, and that's what you see a lot of people really after this game. I was just looking around Twitter and kind of reading some stuff, and I think that's the biggest thing is people point out is just how much of a difference maybe there is in terms of, like you said, sort of that gap between what the resume looks like and maybe the actual performance metrics and all of that. But I guess, if you're Missouri, though, it's like, well, we're still at that point to where you probably look at it and say, well, we know Illinois is going to continue to kind of be, as we talked about, one of the better teams in the country. You certainly expect Tennessee and Alabama to continue on their trajectory. But I think maybe one of the problems, too, is that, Missouri's losses sometimes, and I thought someone pointed out and did a good job with this, is like when Missouri plays bad, like they play bad. Like it's not one of those where, I guess the Auburn game was sort of the exception, but when you think about it, they lose this game at Ole Miss by 21. They lost that game at Mississippi State by 15. They got blown out at Tennessee, at the end of the last year, December 30th. And so it's almost like when they have some of these games, they go so far in the wrong direction that you really start to question, okay, like, is this team, where is that consistency? If you're having some of these games where you play so well and maybe you win some close games, because let's think about it too, a lot of their wins, at least recently, and I guess you could even go back to some of the ones in non-conference play, they've been pretty close wins. Like the TCU game we talked about, like they had to rally to get that one. The Kentucky game, that was a fight to get the 5-point win. Then they, were able to hold off Alabama to get a 3-point win. So I don't know that they are just going out, they're not Gonzaga. They're not just going out and blasting teams and being able to just run away with it. But maybe that's the difference, is that when they do play so bad, it's not pretty. And I think, they need to avoid the aspect of now they get ready to play Arkansas on Saturday, We've talked about Arkansas. They're a team that's hungry for wins. This would be a significant win for Arkansas. This would be exactly what they need to feel much better about where they're going to sit in the tournament. So I think this is another tricky game for Missouri. I feel like they have to be able to bounce back here, but really, for the most part, the good news I think for Missouri is that after their losses, they have bounced back pretty well. So maybe that's something you have going for you, and the fact that they have played a lot better at home than they have on the road. So that's something too. Those aspects, I feel like we'll talk about the game, going into the weekend, but I do feel like there's at least a good opportunity for them to bounce back. And by the way, I just found that Ole Miss is other game that they're going to have to make up would be against South Carolina. So that's not really going to do a whole lot for them.
No, that's another one that you have to win because the consequence if you don't is detrimental, but it doesn't help you. And frankly, when you're in that position that Ole Miss is in, those are not the kinds of games that you want. I would rather play a Florida or someone like that if you win, it gives you another notch in the belt. But that's a little bit problematic for the Rebels too, I think.
Yeah, I kept looking it up, but I think it is South Carolina. So that's you've got to. And that's not going to be easy. Like we said, it's the SEC, and just looking at numbers and saying, well, they should finish 4-1 is a lot easier said than done. So they're not going to have any easy games, but if they play like they did against Missouri, they should win the majority of the games they have left.
Blake, in yesterday's podcast, we talked about LSU and how the Tigers have started to teeter with the brink of the NCAA bubble. I think most people feel the Tigers are in or were in the tournament before last night, but again, it was a shaky resume for reasons we have discussed. We also said that when Darius Days got back, that might have a huge impact on the trajectory of their season. Well, little did we know yesterday that Darius Days was going to play last night. Not only did he play, he played fantastically well. He goes 6 of 10 from the field in 29 minutes. He gets 11 rebounds, scores 16 points. LSU goes to Starkville and handles Mississippi State pretty well in that one by a score of 94-80. I think after last night, if you set the field, the Tigers are squarely in, and it really was an LSU-type effort on offense. Cameron Thomas has 25 points. Javonte Smart has 22. Trendon Watford has 14. So that was, to me, your prototypical, when LSU shows up on a good LSU night, that's what it looks like. And my goodness, I think that's a team that needed that right now.
Yeah, and that's what we always said with them is they don't have to be great on defense. I mean, they're not, but like they don't have to be because they can be like one of the better teams in the league and really one of the better teams in the country when we're just talking about offense. And so sometimes they can just simply go out and outscore people. And having Darius Days back, that was big. I mean, the guy comes back and just gets a double just like that. And we've said before, like Cam Thomas, Trendon Watford, like those are two of the better players in the SEC, and I think Javonte Smart, you just look at what he brings to the table to have 11 assists and two turnovers. I mean, this guy is, he's been someone that's played into what they've done here over the past couple of years. But I just think this team, again, I think they're frustrating at times because you realize how good they can be on offense and that you just want them to kind of be able to hit that point on defense, and it's just not always there. But when you're scoring the way that they scored last night in that game, you don't have to be great on defense, and it's okay to have some defensive lapses because Mississippi State they still went, they still shot 66% from inside 3-point range, and they shot it pretty well actually from 3-point range too. So I think this LSU team is always going to be one that's dangerous at times just because they can score it. They have the playmakers that they have. And just what they can do, especially with Darius Days on the floor, that just gives you a little bit more of something. I don't know, that they're one of those teams when we have the depth conversation. Like they don't have, the deep rotation to where you just feel like you have guys coming off the bench that are just going to, put up 20 points a game or anything like that. But they have such a solid sort of, nucleus of the guys that are on the floor that it just, man, that they can play with anyone. And I think this was another game that proved that. They didn't start off great here, but that they were able to kind of turn this into the really a type of performance that they absolutely needed.
Well, we have made a lot of LSU's defensive struggles, and they're very real. The Tigers rank 148th in Ken Palm on defense right now, and again, struggled last year. So this is not going to be a team that I think is going to lock you down anytime soon. But having said that, there was some small victories in there for the Tigers last night, or maybe a couple of big ones. Abdul Adu scores 2 points in 25 minutes, doesn't even get off a shot from the field. Now, again, he's not one of State's big guns, but he's a guy that can get 10 or 12, and that makes a difference in a game like this. The bigger thing, though, was DJ Stewart and Iverson Molinar. Neither of those guys was that effective last night. Stewart only gets 5 points in 37 minutes, 2 of 8 from the field. Molinar gets 16, but it takes him 14 shots. I think when you look at State offensively, you say, we got to stop those two guards. And I think LSU, again, that's one of the things, if you look at the box score, going in that you hold Stewart and Molinar to those numbers, you've got a really good shot to win the game the way you can score. So if I'm LSU, I'm looking at that as a bit of a defensive victory last night in light of knowing who you had to stop and in light of knowing that you did that.
Yeah, I mean, they need stuff like that to build off of. Just again, based on their level of consistency on that side of the court. And I think, when they can execute a game plan, on defense, that's going to give, I'm sure, Will Wade and his staff a big victory because, they just, there are going to be some of these games, like this game where they were so good on offense that they were able to be able to, win this game by 14, put up 94 points and all of that. They didn't have to hold Mississippi State to 55 to win. But also, they're going to be those games where maybe they're not playing to this level on offense. And so they're going to need stuff like that on defense to where you're able to key in on the guys that you need to key in on to be able to win a game. And that's kind of what they did here, like you said, with some of the guys on Mississippi State. So I thought it was one that really could have went either way. We talked about it. I thought it was sort of a toss-up type of game. And I think for LSU to win it the way that they did, that gives you a little bit more confidence, I think, in them moving forward because you would at least, in their minds, like they understood how important of a game this was, considering that they're right there on that line as an 11 seed or whatever. They could not afford to lose this game. And so this puts them, at least for now, back in that situation to where, okay, we feel a little bit better about things, even though this isn't a win that does a ton for you, but it at least puts them back on that ground to where, okay, we feel like we're playing better now. Maybe we can kind of turn this into something.
Well, and to that, again, Tennessee is not a team that needs a ton of confidence. It's a preseason Final Four team in the minds of some. And I think most people would have had the Vols Final Four Elite Eight category before the season. Tennessee really not far off that at this point. But the Vols have had some bumps in January, as we have noted. Played a couple of games poorly back-to-back against Florida and Missouri and paid for it. Georgia last night, as we said, that's not a win that is going to get you a lot of points with the committee, but it's a team that's been kind of hot recently, has won several games that I don't think most of it's expected. So the Vols get an 89-81 win over Georgia. And if you just look at the final score, again, not that impressive, but I don't think it reflects the way the game was played. Tennessee led that 44-26 at half. Really, the Vols got off to a fast start. This was never a game. Maybe let Georgia back in it late where the Bulldogs got it under 10, but never really threatened to take the lead at any point. So if I'm Tennessee, I look at this, and we have said time and time again, with the Vols, it's offense, right? But you have seen lately Keon Johnson and Jaden Springer have really stepped up their games, both tremendously talented freshman guards. Last night it's Springer. He goes 9 of 11 from the field and gets 30 points. We've seen Keon Johnson jump up and have some big games lately, but I think when Springer is playing at that level, all of a sudden Tennessee starts to creep back to that territory of what we thought it was going to be in the preseason, Blake.
Yeah, completely different whenever that he is at that level, because that was the conversation we had so much going into the season, was that the reason we thought Tennessee could be a Final Four type team was because it was an example of knowing that you had freshmen like that coming in that could be kind of those playmakers on offense. And I think that's exactly what these guys have proven to be now. I mean, we've said it so many times. With Springer, they're a different team. Keon Johnson has really come along, and by the way, he had a dunk of the year type of candidate in that game too, and I know that one was all over the place on social media and just definitely a Sports Center top 10 type of dunk. So they've got those guys coming along, and that's such a huge difference, I think, for them. To get it's really fun to look at. Like Jaden Springer goes for 30. Santiago Vescovi goes for 19. Josiah Jordan-James goes for 18. Keon Johnson goes for 11. Those are all freshmen and sophomores. Like those are four guys who are underclassmen, and that's pretty impressive. I think to see them have that type of game. If all four of those guys can have games like that combined, like Tennessee's going to beat them in pretty much everyone they play the rest of the way. Like I don't know if they're going to beat Gonzaga or Baylor or anyone like that, but if they can get that from those guys, you're going to have a hard time beating them. And let's keep in mind too, Tennessee did lead. What was it? I think they were up 6. They were 23 with like 10 minutes left, and then Georgia just went on a tear and scored all those points that they did towards the end, but. Also, Tennessee did this without E. Pons, and I think that's also important to point out because he is such an anchor on that defense. And like we said, maybe it's not as surprising for Tennessee to kind of give up the points they did in the final portion of the second half just without him on the floor, but they thoroughly dominated this game up until that point. So I think that's another point that we say, hey, that's pretty impressive for them to do that without him on the floor, knowing that he's arguably the most important player on the floor for them. And to do it against the Georgia team, as we said, it has been pretty red hot up to this point.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'd forgotten that Pons hadn't played, but I look at the scoring for the Vols because, look, the defense has never really been in question. I think they're still number one in Ken Pom in defensive efficiency, but you see the scoring burden has started to shift for them a little bit. Victor Bailey was, I think, their leading scorer for a while. Now Bailey is more of kind of a 7-8 point a night guy for them at this point. He got 7 exactly last night. We talked about Springer and Johnson carrying more of the load. No, the concern I have for Tennessee, maybe it's not a concern. Maybe it's just a product of the schedule or just a run that a player has. But John Fulkerson really has not been anywhere near what we've seen from him as an offensive player. He has only scored double digits once in the last 6 games, and that was 11 points against Kansas in a blowout. Doesn't get any against Kentucky and gets 4 last night in 35 minutes. Again, we're picking nits here, right? Because the Vols didn't need it last night. But are we concerned at all that John Fulkerson hasn't been the contributor lately that I think we thought he would be?
Yeah, I think that's something, that's the ongoing conversation. It seems like we've had maybe even, I don't know, probably early on in SEC play. I think we started to look at it and say, maybe this is not to the point that we thought he would be. And I don't know, like it's a tough one because, it is sort of a different team this year when you look at last year's team and this year's team adding in those freshmen. And I feel like, certainly it's a different type of style that they're playing. Maybe they're doing some things a little bit differently, especially on offense, because, they have had to try some things because it hasn't worked at times this season, as we've said. You could look at some of those games and certainly understand that they just have not pack that punch on offense that they wanted to. So I don't know. That's a hard one to figure out for me too, just in watching some of the games, because it's not like he's really, he hasn't been in foul trouble a whole lot. There are lots of things that maybe you could say, well, maybe that's that. You look at it and say that's the reason why he struggled here or there, but like that isn't it. I don't know what it is, but it's certainly something that I think for them, again, to be a team that can make a run to a Final Four, I think they've got to have him, being able to contribute, whether it's, he doesn't have to score 20 points a night, but like just having someone like he did maybe early in the season where he's contributing 10, 11, 12 points, something like that. I feel like if they can get that out of him, because we know, like we said, you're not going to have those 4 guys we mentioned earlier, the underclassmen guards, aren't necessarily going to be able to have that same scoring output every single night. So you need someone like him to be able to step up and offer that, knowing that his specialty, yes, is still probably on the defensive side, as is the same case for E. Pons. But I think this is one where if you're Tennessee and you want to go far in the NCAA tournament, he's someone that's going to be a big part of that, and so that's going to be something to watch moving forward.
On the Georgia side, the thing that you knew that you needed to do if you were Tennessee was stop Severe Wheeler. And I think the Vols did that really well. He gets 11 points, but it takes him 11 shots. The bigger thing is 5 assists to 7 turnovers. If you know that's going to be his box score line, you have to feel pretty good about Tennessee winning. That's how it played out. But for Georgia, one guy we haven't talked about at all on this podcast is Katie Johnson, the freshman. He missed the first 11 games, but he's been a very consistent scoring presence for them. He gets 22 last night, which is a season high. So you talk about youth for Tennessee and things to build on. For Georgia, that's the one thing I think positive that you take away from that game. Well, two things, I guess. You didn't fold in Knoxville. You made it a fight late, even if the score, maybe the final wasn't indicative of the way the game was played. At least you had that. And then I think the way he played was, again, a thing. Also 3 steals, by the way. So I think that's a thing if you're Georgia and Tom Crean, you take away as a positive.
Yeah, agreed. I think you look at it that way because, Johnson, he started playing, I want to say mid-January, something like that. So he has, I don't know, he's probably got 10 games under his belt at this point maybe. But he has. I mean, he's been someone that has shown that he can score, and certainly they're going to need him, down the stretch here, especially, as we said, given their schedule. But I think this Georgia team is, as we said, I mean, they've had this stretch here recently where they played really well. We didn't expect them to win this game, but I think just seeing the way maybe they finished this game, that is something that you can build on if you're Tom Crean, knowing that you're about to have to play at Alabama, and you're going to need to score points probably to be able to win that game in Tuscaloosa, and then you play. I mean, we talked about it before. I mean, Georgia's got one of the toughest schedules left of anybody, so they've got to be able to put some things together if they want to win some games down the stretch. Because right now, the only game they'll be favored in potentially would be the South Carolina game at the end, and they've still got to make one up too. So I think for Georgia, there are some positive you can build on because they do have some younger guys that have talent. You mentioned Wheeler, obviously Johnson, guys like that. But I don't know exactly, where things stand. Maybe for Georgia here moving forward. I know it's been an interesting discussion too for Georgia, and I know Georgia fans maybe are starting to get frustrated that they haven't gotten to that level, and maybe that's sort of the hangover effect of having the number 1 pick in the NBA draft last year and not being able to do anything with it. But I'm very curious to see just kind of what this Georgia program looks like moving forward because, as we say, it's not easy to kind of just stay right there and get in the top of the pack in the SEC, and I'm very curious to see kind of what their trajectory looks like.
Blake, any parting thoughts before we close the show today?
Nope. Like you said, we got a big weekend of games, which I'm sure we'll talk about on Friday. But there's just we got to win games at this point. Like that's what we're saying. We bring up all these scenarios about what potentially teams need to do and all that. The best formula for success and to get into the tournament and to stay out of the bubble is just to win games because elsewhere there's too many things. This season especially, there are too many things that could not go in your favor due to the conference tournament situation, due to potential cancellations, postponements, all that kind of stuff. So the best formula if you're a team in the SEC that wants to get in the tournament, just win. That's all you got to do.
And what would be the best formula to follow our work here at the 14?
Yes, like you said, we have gotten everything up and going now. We're on Apple Podcasts. We're on Spotify. Search for either the 14 or Southeastern 14. You can find us on there. I know other people have asked about different, podcasting platforms, apps, and all that. It'll get there eventually. It takes a little time to get on the third-party apps and the different stuff like Google and all that. So it'll be there. May not be the next day or two, but eventually it'll be on there. So you can just keep searching and find it there. But if you want to listen to everything immediately, just go to our Twitter at 14 Southeastern, and you can find everything you need on there. And we got a lot of exciting stuff coming up.
Yeah, very excited about tomorrow's show. We will kick off our baseball coverage with a major announcement on our plans with that going forward. So anyway, thank you for listening to this one. Be sure to tune in to Friday's episode, especially if you are a baseball fan. We will also preview the weekend basketball slate. But anyway, hope you are enjoying the podcast. Be sure to tell a couple of friends about what we do. Again, we are a daily podcast, and we're not going away anytime soon. So thank you for listening today. I'm your host, Chris Lee. I've been joined by Blake Lovell. We will catch you again tomorrow with another episode of The 14.